Hello everyone, I thought I'd just show you what I was doing to test and clean some injectors ahead of a Megasquirt install, which I'm going to attempt later. This is the fuel rail and injectors off a Rover V8 3.5 litre. The engine had done about 100,000 miles. It sat doing nothing for about 10 years, so I really wasn't sure whether these injectors were going to be okay. They're also the old style injectors because it's off the flapper injection system, so they've got the hose actually crimped onto the injector itself, so I didn't really want to disturb the connections to the fuel rail. All the hoses looked okay, they weren't perished or anything, so I figured I'd just leave those alone. So the first thing I did was to make something to open and close the injector, each injector periodically, and the easiest way for me to do that was with a TI launch pad, which is a Arduino-esque microcontroller development board. Lots of people use a switch with a 9-volt battery or a flasher unit or whatever. My reason for using this was that later on I want to measure the throughput through each of the injectors, and so I can program this to accurately control the pulse widths, and that's another story. So having got that working, the first thing I did was to use some throttle body cleaner and back flush all the injectors. So I just put this rubber hose over the end, held it down, and then each time the injector opened it would push it back in the opposite direction through the injector. And the thinking was that might dislodge any debris that was in the filter baskets, which will be in here somewhere, which I can't get out. And I did that about 3 times over a period of 2 weeks, and there was quite a lot of debris that came out actually. Certainly the petrol came out dirty colour at first, and then it gradually cleaned up. And after that I figured that the injectors were pretty clean. But I had to buy a new fuel pump anyway. I only had the low pressure variant, so I figured I'd just set it up on the bench and look at the spray pattern and see whether they were all performing properly. So there's a reservoir. The reason it's red is because it's got Red-X in it. I'll tell you a bit about that later. And the pump is just pumping through a standard injection filter through the fuel rail and then back into the reservoir again. Where the 9th injector used to go, which is there, I've actually put a pressure gauge on there so that I can look at the fuel pressure and check that the regulator's working properly. So first of all, I just tried this with petrol, expecting everything to be pretty good, and what I found was that every time the injector opened, I got a different spray pattern. And in fact this one over here was the worst of the bunch, and on some occasions it didn't even close, or opened halfway, and generally was pretty poor. So I can show you, I'll show you in a minute what it's like now, but at that point I realised that perhaps I wasn't going to get away with these injectors, so I tried putting some Red-X in. I've always thought this was snake oil, but apparently it isn't. So this bottle was enough for 2 tanks. So there was 2 litres in here when I started, so it's much more concentrated than it used to be. And it took about 10 minutes, and then after 10 minutes I was getting a repeatable spray pattern every time the injector opened. And the one with a cross on it there did actually start to close properly, and after a while, and it's now completely repeatable. And I'll show you how that looks. I've got a different power supply running the fuel pump because it's quite thirsty, but you can see now that there's fuel flowing, and the fuel regulator is working properly at about 38 psi or thereabouts. So if I turn on the injector, you can see the spray pattern isn't perfect, but it's not half bad, and it's probably the best I'm going to get with 100,000 mile old injectors. But it's looking good. So one of the things I did discover is once I did the Red-X, when I turn the pump off, if I just stop that injector now, when I turned the pump off, the fuel pressure, whereas before it sat at about the same pressure that it used to, when you turn the pump off, which I'm going to do now, that pressure then decayed almost instantly to 0. And what I think happened there was that the Redex dislodged some more stuff in the fuel rail, and it got lodged under the diaphragm of the fuel pressure regulator and stopped it closing down properly. So that caused the loss of pressure. And I actually fixed that just by taking this tube off and putting my thumb over the end. And I discovered then that the fuel pump was quite happy to pump to 120 psi or more. It went right round on this gauge until it was vertical. But when I released my finger, that seemed to have shifted it, and then it started to behave as usual. So that's about it. The next stage will be measuring the throughput of these so that I can alter the trim tables in Megasquirt. Alright, cheers.